Out of nowhere, the peace of Judge Leary's secluded life was shattered by an uninvited and unwelcome knock on his door. A group of police officers, armed with nothing but their demands, arrived at his doorstep. No warrant, no explanation, claiming they needed to search his land. But what they didn't realize was that they had just threatened the wrong person. As the situation escalates, Leary uncovers a terrifying truth. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone powerful had set him up. And now his life was in far greater danger than he ever imagined. Judge Thomas Leary had always been a man of routine. A district judge by profession, he spent his weekdays presiding over cases in the courthouse, dispensing justice with a level-headed demeanor that earned him respect from all corners. But his weekends were a different story. He cherished the solitude of his property, a stretch of land nestled in the quiet corners of the county. There, surrounded by the thick pines and the steady hum of nature, he could forget the world of paperwork and verdicts. His house, a modest stone structure, sat atop a hill where the breeze could carry his thoughts far away from the cases and conflicts of the courtroom. It had been a slow Saturday morning. The sky was still painted with the faint pinks of dawn, and the birds were just beginning their songs when Judge Leary decided to take a walk around the property. His boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way toward the old oak tree by the creek, a spot that had become a kind of ritual for him. The land had been in his family for generations, and every inch of it held a memory, a story. It was a place of peace, a place he could always count on for silence, silence that, in his line of work, was both a blessing and a necessity. But that morning, the silence was broken in the most unexpected way. From behind a bend in the narrow gravel path leading up to his home, the unmistakable sound of tires on dirt interrupted the stillness. At first, Judge Leary thought it was just a passing car, a neighbor perhaps, or someone lost. But the sound grew louder, and before he knew it, a group of 3 police vehicles came into view, kicking up a cloud of dust as they barreled down the driveway. His heart sank a little. This was no ordinary visit, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up in warning. Hey, real quick. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The officers piled out of their vehicles without so much as a wave. They didn't seem like they were here to chat, and they certainly didn't look like they were on routine patrol. One of them, a tall man with a square jaw and dark sunglasses, stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. "Morning, Judge," he said, though there was nothing friendly in his tone. Judge Leary's first instinct was to offer a greeting, but the words caught in his throat. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He'd seen many things over the years, but a surprise visit from the police without any prior notice was unsettling, especially at his private home, where he'd made it a point to keep the peace. "We need to search your property," the officer said bluntly, without even a hint of explanation. The words hung in the air, thick with uncertainty. "Search my property?" Judge Leary echoed, his brow furrowing. "Do you have a warrant?" The officer hesitated for a split second, then shook his head. "We're investigating a serious matter in the area. We have reason to believe the suspect may be hiding out here. We just need to take a look." The judge's calm exterior cracked for just a moment. He'd spent a lifetime in the law, and he knew what was required to conduct a search. A warrant, at the very least. This wasn't right. His property wasn't some random spot to be searched on a whim. The law didn't work that way. "I'm afraid that's not how this works," Judge Leary said, his voice cool but firm.
"You can't come on my land without proper authorization." The officer's gaze flickered briefly, and then he squared his shoulders. "We don't have time for this, Judge. Either you cooperate, or we'll make you." There was something
in the officer's tone, a thinly veiled threat that sent a shiver down Leary's spine. These weren't the kind of officers who'd make a mistake by accidentally wandering onto the wrong property. They knew exactly what they were doing, or so it seemed. The question was, why had they come to his land? There was no reason he could think of. Nothing to suggest he had any connection to whatever crime they were investigating. A quiet tension simmered between them, the weight of the moment growing heavier with each passing second. The judge's mind raced. Was this a genuine misunderstanding, or was there something more sinister at play? Maybe they were simply out of their depth, a little too eager, or maybe there was an agenda behind the scenes that he wasn't privy to. Either way, the situation felt off, And Judge Leary wasn't one to back down in the face of injustice. He'd spent his life fighting for the law. He wasn't about to let it be trampled on in his own backyard. "Well, officer," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took a step back, "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave. And if you don't, I'll be forced to contact the sheriff." The officer's face tightened. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was the only thing that could be heard, until the officer finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "We'll see about that, Judge." The standoff had begun. The stillness of the morning hung, heavy in the air, thick with tension. Judge Leary stood on the edge of his property, facing down the officers as they towered over him. He could feel the weight of their stares, their silent challenge, but he didn't flinch. He had spent years in courtrooms, arguing cases, standing firm in the face of much fiercer opponents. This wasn't his first confrontation with authority, but it was the first time he'd found himself so completely at odds with the law on his own land. "Without a warrant," he said again, his voice steady despite the brewing storm. "You cannot come on my property. I've made that clear." The officer in charge, still the one with the square jaw and the dark sunglasses, frowned, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're really going to make this difficult, Judge? We're investigating a matter of public safety. You have no idea what's at stake here." His voice was now tinged with annoyance, but Leary wasn't buying it. He'd been around long enough to know when someone was bluffing. The judge folded his arms and leaned back slightly, his posture firm, grounded. "I'm aware of the law, officer, and I'm telling you, without a warrant, you're trespassing. If you want to search this land, you need to follow the proper procedures." The officers behind him shifted uneasily, their impatience growing palpable. One of them, a younger officer, maybe in his late 20s, with a fresh face and a nervous twitch in his eye, glanced back toward the vehicles. His hand hovered near his radio, like he was itching to make a call, but he seemed hesitant, as though waiting for some kind of approval from his superior. The older officer, clearly growing, frustrated, stepped closer, his voice lowering to a threatening tone. "You don't want to make an enemy out of us, Judge. We're just trying to do our job here. But if you're going to block us, we'll have to report you for obstruction of justice. That's a crime." Judge Leary raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he might smile. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Obstruction of justice? You're the ones trespassing on private land without a warrant, and you're accusing me of obstructing justice? That's rich. The officer's jaw clenched, and for a brief moment it looked like he was going to lose his cool completely. He glanced at the younger officer, who seemed eager to do something, anything, to keep the situation from escalating. But the older officer held him back, breathing through his nose as if trying to regain his composure. "Fine," the officer spat. "We'll call for backup." The younger officer immediately reached for his radio, his fingers trembling slightly as he keyed in the request. Judge Leary watched him with quiet amusement, but there was no hiding the unease that tightened his chest. Backup. Why did they need backup? There was no indication that his property was anything but a quiet, secluded corner of the county. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right here, that there was something more behind this visit, something they weren't telling him. The older officer turned to Leary, his tone shifting, more insistent now. "You're making a mistake, Judge. We're not asking for permission anymore. We're going to do this with or without your cooperation. But if you stand in our way, don't think for a second we won't take action." Leary took a step back, his gaze flicking toward the trees, the horizon beyond his land. He'd spent enough time in law to know when a situation was escalating beyond control. He could hear the faint crackle of the radio in the officer's hand as the call for backup went out, a growing sense of foreboding spreading across the land, like the shadows of the trees stretching in the morning light. Something was off. And it wasn't just the officer's increasingly defensive behavior. No, this felt like a power struggle, a battle of wills that had nothing to do with the law at all. The more they pushed, the more it became clear. This wasn't about a simple search. This wasn't about investigating a crime. The judge's gut twisted with unease as the sound of another vehicle rolled in from the distance, tires crunching the gravel at the end of the driveway. The officers were acting like they had no choice but to escalate this, but what were they really after? Was there something on his property that they weren't telling him? Something he hadn't noticed? The backup arrived with a sense of urgency, and the officers' movements became more deliberate, more calculated. Leary's heart beat a little faster, the suspicion creeping into his mind, but he kept his face neutral, giving nothing away. What was this all really about? And why were they so desperate to search his land? As the backup vehicles parked and more officers stepped out, Leary's thoughts raced. He had been a judge for years, a man of principles, a man of the law, and yet here he was, standing on his own land, watching as the very system he had spent his life serving seemed to turn against him. The officer with the dark sunglasses stepped forward again, his jaw set in a hard line. "I told you, Judge," he said, almost in a whisper now. "You won't win this." The tension in the air had thickened, so palpable it felt like it might snap at any second. Judge Leary stood at the center of it, his arms crossed in a stance that mirrored his calm, unflappable nature. The officers had brought their backup, 4 more men now standing at the ready, eyes darting from him to one another. Their uniforms were crisp, their hands resting too casually on their weapons, the weight of their authority now almost suffocating. But as they spoke, as their words grew sharper, something about the situation didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the manner in which they approached him, or the way they'd acted like they were above the law. It was something deeper, something unspoken, that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. Leary shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that went unnoticed by the officers but allowed him to scan them more carefully. He was a judge, after all. He'd spent his life reading people, assessing motives, understanding what was hidden behind the carefully constructed facades of courtroom rhetoric, and right now he could feel the cracks in their stories. Taking a breath, he decided to play a different game. Instead of resisting outright, he leaned forward just slightly, his tone casual, almost friendly. "So, officer," he said, looking at the man with the square jaw, "you said you were investigating a serious crime. Care to fill me in on the details? It's not every day I get a group of police officers marching up my driveway without so much as a hello." The officer shifted, uncomfortable under the judge's probing gaze, but didn't answer right away. The other officers behind him exchanged quick glances, but none spoke up. Leary pressed on. I'm curious. You're telling me you have a suspect, but you didn't bother getting a warrant first? Seems like a rookie mistake. Or am I missing something?" The officer's jaw tightened, but he was forced to answer, his pride preventing him from ignoring the question. "We're acting on intelligence," he muttered. "The situation is complicated." Leary smiled slightly, not at all fooled by the vague response. "Complicated, huh? Must be if you're out here without the proper paperwork. What exactly are you looking for, officer? A weapon? A person? Or is it something else entirely?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp but measured. For a brief moment there was silence. Then the officer's eyes flicked to his colleagues, a quick, nervous look. The tension in the group was palpable, the uncertainty creeping through their postures. One of the younger officers cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke up. We don't have a warrant," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. There it was, the moment of truth. Leary's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. He had suspected it, but hearing the confirmation was still a punch to the gut. No warrant, no legal grounds, just a group of officers, and who knows what else behind them, trying to force their way onto his property. The whole thing smelled like trouble, like something more sinister was at play. "Interesting," Leary said quietly, his gaze never leaving the officer. "You're telling me you came out here, on my land, with no legal basis, and no permission, and now you're just going to search? Is that the plan?" The officer shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, Judge," he began, but his words faltered under the weight of the judge's scrutiny. "We're looking for something important. Someone, actually. Someone who might be hiding out in the area." Leary's brow furrowed. "A fugitive?" The officer nodded, but his answer felt rehearsed, almost too practiced. Leary wasn't buying it. There was something more, something they weren't telling him. The officers were still holding their ground, but the cracks were widening. If they weren't looking for a fugitive, then what were they really after? And why come to his land, of all places? "We've got intel," the officer continued, but this time his voice was lower, as though he didn't want to say too much. "But it's not just about the fugitive. There's more going on here. Bigger things. Things that a flash of Something crossed the officer's face, something Leary couldn't quite place, before the man quickly masked it with a forced cough. The admission hung in the air like a secret, and in that moment, the pieces finally started to come together. The judge took a step forward, his voice calm but full of authority. "Bigger things? Care to elaborate?" but the officer's resolve was beginning to crack. His eyes darted to the other officers, and for the first time, Leary saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes too. The officer cleared his throat again, shifting uncomfortably. "Look, we're not supposed to share too much," he muttered. "But this investigation goes beyond just a fugitive. There's something else we're looking for." Leary could sense it. He was being pulled into something much larger, something hidden beneath layers of half-truths. He wasn't just a bystander in this story anymore. He was a player, and whether he liked it or not, this game of cat and mouse had just taken a dangerous turn. The officer's confession hung in the air like a fog, thick with secrets. And Leary, for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, a sense that he wasn't in control of this story anymore, whatever they were. Really after, it was clear his property was at the heart of something far bigger than a simple police investigation. But what was it? And more importantly, why had they come for him? The moment had arrived, the tension hanging in the air so thick it seemed to have weight pressing down on everyone involved. Judge Leary stood still, his gaze calm yet penetrating, the quiet authority of his presence only growing more pronounced as the officers continued to squirm. Every word they spoke, every shift of their posture, told a story he was beginning to piece together. But the one thing he hadn't told them yet, the one card he had kept close, was the truth. As the officer with the square jaw opened his mouth, again, clearly gearing up for another round of threats and intimidation, the judge decided it was time to stop playing along. He let the silence stretch, just long enough for them to begin second-guessing themselves. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he spoke. "I think it's time I told you who I am." The words fell into the quiet like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading out with surprising force. The officers paused, their eyes darting to one another, uncertainty suddenly clouding their faces. For a split second, Leary could see the wheels turning in their heads, how they'd been pushing, how they'd been expecting to bulldoze over this old man on his quiet plot of land. But now they were realizing that something fundamental had just shifted. "I'm the district judge of this area," Leary said, his voice even, almost casual, as if revealing his true identity was the most natural thing in the world. "You've been harassing the wrong man." For a moment, there was no response. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that stretch of silence, the full weight of Leary's words began to sink in. The officer with the dark sunglasses blinked, his face going pale as realization dawned. The other officers stood frozen, their eyes widening as if they'd just stepped into a room full of fire. They had been challenging one of the highest legal authorities in the district, a district judge no less. "Wait, you're the—" one of the younger officers stammered, his voice shaking. "You're the judge?" Leary nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting in a thin, almost pitying smile. "That's right. I've been the judge around here for more years than I care to count, and you've just walked into a legal nightmare." His tone was measured, but there was a certain satisfaction in watching the officers, who had once stood so confidently against him, now recoil in disbelief. The power dynamic in the yard shifted faster than a gust of wind. The arrogance that had marked their earlier bravado was evaporating, leaving behind only the raw sting of embarrassment. They had made a monumental mistake, one they couldn't take back. The silence that followed was thick with their discomfort. Officer who had led the charge, the one with the square jaw and the most forceful tone, stepped back, his hands suddenly raised in an almost apologetic gesture. "Judge, we didn't know." "No," Leary interrupted, his voice sharp now, the judge in him coming to the forefront. "You didn't know, and that's exactly the problem. You didn't take the time to do your homework. You didn't bother to check who you were dealing with." His eyes narrowed. "You came onto my land, without a warrant, and without even a shred of legal authority. You violated my rights, and now you'll have to answer for it." The officers were no longer defiant. Now they were scrambling. The one who had been so brash only moments ago, the one who had threatened to report the judge for obstruction of justice, was now backpedaling, fumbling with his words in an attempt to save face. We thought, we just assumed." The officer's voice faltered, but it was too late. The damage was done. Leary, his mind already racing through the potential legal ramifications, took a step forward. "Let me make this clear. You've not only trespassed, but you've also jeopardized your careers. All of you. What you've done today, it could cost you your jobs, your badges, and your freedom. You could be facing charges of unlawful search and seizure, not to mention misconduct. The officers looked at each other, the reality of what they had done hitting them like a sledgehammer. Their eyes darted nervously, but none of them dared to challenge the weight of the judge's words. The tension was broken, but it was replaced with the heavy realization that their actions had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "Now I suggest you leave my property," Leary continued, his voice firm. "And when you do, you better hope that this doesn't make it to the higher-ups. Because if it does, you'll have far more to answer for than you ever imagined." The officers didn't need to be told twice. One by one, they turned and started to retreat toward their vehicles, their heads hung low, their pride shattered in the wake of their mistakes. As the last of them left, Leary stood alone, the morning light now fully shining on his land. The breeze had picked up, and the quiet hum of nature returned to fill the silence left in their wake. The judge let out a slow breath, his mind still spinning with the questions that remained. Were these officers just acting on their own, or had they been sent by someone else? Was this truly the end of the story? The crowd of officers faded from sight, but the questions lingered. And as Leary watched them disappear down the driveway, he couldn't help but wonder, what had they really been looking for? Was this all just a mistake, or had they been part of something far bigger? The crunch of gravel beneath the tires of the last police vehicle was the final sound that lingered in the air as the officers disappeared down the long, winding driveway. Judge Leary stood there for a moment, staring after them, his feet planted firmly on the ground as if to reassure himself that this wasn't just some dream he would wake up from. The morning sunlight was brighter now, the sky clear and unclouded, but the weight of the situation settled heavily in his chest. Relief washed over him in waves, but it was tempered with something far more unsettling. He had won this battle. Yes, but the victory felt hollow. The sense of control he had once held so proudly over his life had been shattered, exposed like a wound that couldn't be ignored. For the first time in years, the quiet life he had so carefully cultivated felt fragile, like glass just waiting to crack. The police had left, but he knew that nothing would be the same. Leary turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the vast expanse of his land, the rolling hills, the trees that had stood for generations, his ancestors' legacy. It had all felt like a safe haven, a place where he could escape the noise of the world, a place where justice was as clear-cut as the law itself. But now, a strange unease twisted in his gut. This encounter was only a glimpse of something darker, a crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew. There were forces at play here, forces far beyond the realm of simple legal matters. Forces that didn't care about the law, that didn't respect the boundaries he had so carefully drawn around his life. It wasn't just some rogue officers who had come to his door. No, this was bigger. He could feel it in his bones. The way they had pushed him, the way they'd tried to intimidate him. They hadn't acted alone. Leary's mind raced, and a cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck. Was this a warning? Was he just the first target in a much larger scheme? The officers might have left his property, but their presence had ignited something in him. Something that couldn't be snuffed out by a simple apology or a retreat down his driveway. There were people out there who wanted something from him, something he wasn't sure he was ready to give. His position, his power, had always been a shield. But now, he realized, it could just as easily become a target. He walked slowly toward the porch of his house, his footsteps heavy, and sat down in the old rocking chair that had been passed down through the generations. It creaked beneath his weight as he leaned back, staring out at the trees once more. For the first time in his life, the land that had once brought him peace now felt like a prison. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden buzz of his phone. Leary's heart skipped a beat as he fumbled to answer it, wondering if the call was related to the mess he had just endured. He glanced at the screen. The name flashing there made his blood run cold. It was a number he recognized but had never expected to hear from. Governor's office. Judge Leary? A smooth voice came through the line, one that was both familiar and distant. It was the governor's chief of staff, a man who had been an acquaintance for years. "We need to talk. There's something you need to know about what just happened." The hairs on the back of Leary's neck stood on end. His thoughts scrambled as he listened to the man on the other end, but one phrase made his stomach drop. "We believe someone in the government is involved, and this isn't just about your property. They're targeting you, Judge. You've been caught in the middle of something much bigger. A political scheme." Leary's mind raced as the implications of the words sank in. The world around him, the quiet, serene world he had carefully built, suddenly felt like it was slipping away. He had never imagined that his life could be in danger, not in the way the chief of staff was implying. This wasn't just about rogue officers or a random misunderstanding. Someone at a higher level wanted him gone, and they had the power to make it happen. As the voice on the other end of the phone continued, Leary's thoughts were consumed by the realization that the battle he'd fought that morning was only the beginning. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a pawn in a game much bigger than he could have ever imagined. And whoever was pulling the strings, whoever had orchestrated this attack on his life, wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted. The line went silent for a moment, and then the voice returned, softer now. You need to be careful. Judge, your life could be in danger, and it's not just about the land anymore. There are people watching you. Leary's heart hammered in his chest, and he looked out over the land once more. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind, their rustling now a haunting reminder of how little control he had left. Justice had been served today, but at what cost? He was no longer just a judge in a quiet town. He was a man standing on the edge of something far darker. The phone call ended with a quiet click, leaving Leary alone in the stillness. He sat there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. The air around him seemed to thicken, the weight of his position bearing down harder than ever before. And as the sun began to set, the shadows stretched long across the land, signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But the real question lingered in the back of his mind. Who was behind this, and why was he their target? If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.